The last thing I expected when I moved to Meadowbrook Estates in suburban Denver, Colorado, was to become a criminal over a set of wind chimes. But here I was, standing on my front porch with a certified letter in my hands and pure disbelief coursing through my veins. My name is Xavier Jameson, and I had moved into this pristine neighborhood 6 months ago after accepting a position as the associate conductor for the Colorado Symphony Orchestra. The house was perfect, a charming 2-story craftsman with a wrap-around porch and a view of the Rocky Mountains that made every mortgage payment feel worth it. I had spent those first months settling in, meeting neighbors, and decorating my new space with all the care of someone who planned to stay for decades. The wind chimes hanging from my porch were special. Not the cheap metal tubes you picked up at a garden center, but a custom-made set crafted by a master artisan in Belgium. The orchestra had commissioned them as a gift when I accepted my promotion, and they were tuned to produce the opening notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Each tube was precisely calibrated, made from aircraft-grade aluminum with a bronze finish, and the sound they produced was nothing short of magical. Clear, resonant, and perfectly pitched, I loved those chimes. Every time the wind caught them, I was reminded of the journey that brought me here, of the countless hours of practice, the rejections, the small victories, until finally landing this dream position. They represented everything I had worked for. The letter in my hand said otherwise. According to Patricia Morrison, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, my wind chimes constituted a noise violation under Section 14.7 of the Community Guidelines and needed to be removed immediately, or I would face daily fines of $200. I read the letter 3 times, certain I was missing something. $200 a day for wind chimes. I glanced up at them, swaying gently in the morning breeze, producing their soft, melodious tones. My neighbor to the left, an elderly gentleman named Robert, was watering his roses. He caught my eye and waved. We had shared pleasant conversations about music. He attended symphony performances regularly and had even commented on how much he enjoyed hearing the chimes. My neighbor to the right was a young family with 2 kids who I occasionally saw playing in their yard. The mother, whose name I remembered was Jennifer, had mentioned the chimes reminded her of her grandmother's house in Maine. Nobody had complained, at least, not to me directly. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed at the bottom of the letter. After 3 rings, a woman answered with a clipped, efficient tone. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, Patricia Morrison speaking. Miss Morrison, this is Xavier Jameson from 4782 Willow Creek Drive. I just received your letter about my wind chimes. Oh yes, Mr. Jameson. I trust you will have those removed by end of business today. I gripped the phone tighter. I was hoping we could discuss this. I have not received any complaints from my neighbors, and the chimes are not particularly loud. They were a gift from the Colorado Symphony Orchestra, and they mean a great deal to me. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear papers rustling. Mr. Jameson, it does not matter where the wind chimes came from or what they mean to you. Section 14.7 clearly states that no homeowner shall install or maintain any device that produces audible sound beyond their property line without prior written approval from the HOA board. You did not seek approval. Therefore, they must be removed. I was not aware I needed approval for wind chimes. Surely many people in the neighborhood have them. Other homeowners are not your concern. Your violation is what we are addressing today. The dismissiveness in her tone set my teeth on edge. Can I at least come to the next board meeting and present my case? These are not ordinary wind chimes. They are a work of art, precisely tuned, and they produce minimal sound. I am certain if you heard them yourself, You would understand. The next board meeting is not until the third Thursday of next month. Your fines will begin accruing tomorrow if those chimes are not removed. I suggest you take appropriate action, Mr. Jameson. Good day." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at my beautiful chimes. 28 days until the next meeting. At $200 a day, that would be $5,600 in fines just to keep them hanging until I could make my case. The absurdity of it was stunning. I decided to do what any reasonable person would do. I went to talk to my neighbors. Robert was still in his garden when I walked over. He looked up with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Morning, Xavier. Beautiful day, is it not?" "Morning, Robert. Can I ask you something?" "Do my wind chimes bother you at all?" His eyebrows shot up. "Bother me? Quite the opposite. I find them delightful. Why do you ask?" I showed him the letter. His expression darkened as he read. "Patricia Morrison," he said, shaking his head. "That woman has made it her life's mission to find problems where none exist. Last year, she tried to fine the Hendersons for their rose bushes being the wrong shade of pink. Pink, Xavier. She claimed it clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. What happened? They fought it, spent $3,000 on lawyer fees, and eventually the board backed down. But not before Patricia made their lives miserable for 6 months. She is a piece of work that won. Has anyone else complained about the chimes? Not that I have heard. And believe me, people talk. If there were complaints, I would know. Jennifer from the other side confirmed the same thing when I caught her bringing in groceries. She actually looked horrified at the letter. "That is insane," she said, balancing a bag on her hip. "My kids love your chimes. Tommy calls them the pretty music house. You cannot let them make you take those down." But what choice did I have? I could not afford hundreds of dollars a day in fines. That night I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, reading through every page of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA guidelines. The document was 83 pages long, written in dense legal language that would put anyone to sleep. Section 14.7 did indeed prohibit sound-producing devices without approval. But as I read further, I found something interesting. Section 3.2 stated that the HOA must act consistently in enforcement of all rules and could not selectively target individual homeowners. And Section 9.4 outlined the appeals process, which included the right to present evidence at a hearing before any fines could be legally collected. I was not a lawyer, but I knew how to read music, and law was not so different. It was all about following the structure, understanding the notation, and finding the rhythm. The HOA had rules they had to follow too. The next morning, I drafted a formal response to Patricia Morrison's letter. I acknowledged receipt of her notice, cited the appeals section, and formally requested a hearing before the full board. I hand-delivered it to the HOA office, which was located in a small building near the neighborhood clubhouse. Patricia was there, sitting behind a desk that was far too large for the cramped space. She was exactly what I expected. Mid-50s, blonde hair cut in a severe bob, designer glasses, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. "Mr. Jameson," she said, not bothering to stand. "Have you removed the chimes?" "No, and I will not be doing so until I have had the opportunity to present my case before the board, as is my right under Section 9.4 of the HOA guidelines." I placed my letter on her desk. She glanced at it without picking it up. "You are making this far more difficult than it needs to be. The rules are clear." "Then I am certain the board will have no trouble explaining their position at a hearing. I would like to schedule one as soon as possible." Her jaw tightened. "The board meets when it is convenient for the board members, Mr. Jameson, not at your beck and call." Section 9.4 states that a hearing must be scheduled within 14 business days of a formal request. That gives you until August 23rd. I will be expecting notice of the date and time. I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. You are going to regret this, Mr. Jameson. I have been managing this HOA for 8 years. Nobody wins against me. I looked back at her. This is not about winning, Miss Morrison. It is about what is fair and reasonable. I will see you at the hearing. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated in ways I could not have predicted. 3 days after I delivered my letter, I received another notice. This time, my mailbox was in violation for being the wrong shade of black. Apparently, the approved color was Midnight Black number 472 from the Sherwin-Williams collection, and mine was Onyx Black number 391. $50 per day until corrected. 2 days after that, my front yard was apparently half an inch too tall according to the maximum grass height requirements. Another $50 per day. Then my house numbers were too large. My garden lights were not on the approved fixtures list. My welcome mat was the wrong dimensions. It was harassment, pure and simple. Patricia Morrison was throwing every violation she could manufacture at me, hoping I would crumble under the pressure, but she did not know who she was dealing with. I had spent years as a freelance musician, cobbling together gigs, dealing with difficult conductors, and navigating the politics of orchestra management. I had dealt with difficult people before. I documented everything. I took photographs, saved every letter, and started building a file. I also did something else. I drove around the neighborhood with a notebook and camera, documenting every single violation I could find that the HOA was not enforcing. The Martins on Oakwood had Windchimes. 3 sets, in fact, much louder than mine. No violation notice on their door. The Chens on Maple had grass that was at least 2 inches tall. No violation. The Richardsons had mailbox numbers that were clearly a different font than the approved style. No violation. I documented 47 violations throughout the neighborhood that were identical to or worse than the ones Patricia was citing against me. Every single one was being ignored. The hearing was finally scheduled for August 20th in the clubhouse meeting room. I took the afternoon off from the orchestra and arrived 15 minutes early with a briefcase full of documentation, photographs, and recordings. The board consisted of 5 members. Patricia sat in the center, flanked by 2 other women and 2 men. They all looked at me like I was something they scraped off their shoes. Mr. Jameson, Patricia began, you are here to appeal the violations issued against your property. You have 15 minutes to state your case. I stood, pulling out my laptop and connecting it to the projector I had brought. Patricia frowned. What is all this? Evidence, I said simply. You gave me 15 minutes. I intend to use them. I started with the Windchimes, playing a recording I had made from various distances. At the property line, they were barely audible over normal ambient noise. From the street, you could not hear them at all unless you were specifically listening for them. Then I showed photographs of the other Windchimes in the neighborhood, along with dates showing how long they had been up without violation notices. Next came the mailbox, the grass, the house numbers, and all the other petty violations Patricia had thrown at me. For each one, I showed multiple examples of identical or worse violations throughout Meadowbrook Estates that were not being enforced. Section 3.2 of the HOA guidelines explicitly prohibits selective enforcement, I said, looking directly at Patricia. Yet that is exactly what is happening here. Miss Morrison is targeting me personally, not enforcing the actual rules of the community. This is harassment, and it is a violation of Colorado HOA law. One of the men on the board, whose name placard read David Fletcher, leaned forward. "Do you have proof that Miss Morrison is targeting you specifically?" I pulled out the timeline I had created, showing every violation I had received and the dates. Then I showed my research on violation notices issued to other homeowners over the past 6 months. Out of 273 homes in Meadowbrook Estates, only 9 had received any violations in that time period. I had received 7 notices in 14 days. Furthermore, I continued, I would like to know who actually complained about my wind chimes. Under Colorado HOA statutes, I have the right to face my accuser and review the complaint that initiated this action. Patricia's face had gone red. The identity of complainants is kept confidential to protect residents from retaliation. Actually, that is not entirely accurate, I said. While the HOA can protect identity during initial investigation, once a formal hearing is convened, the homeowner has the right to review all evidence against them, including the source of complaints. I would like to see the original complaint about my wind chimes. The other woman on the board, whose placard reads Susan Kowalski, spoke up. "Patricia, do we have the original complaint?" Patricia shuffled through papers. "It came in through the HOA email. I would have to look it up." "Then I suggest we table this hearing until you can produce the complaint and all related documentation," I said. "Without that, you are asking me to defend against an accusation that may not even exist." David Fletcher nodded slowly. "Mr. Jameson has a point." "Patricia, can you pull up the email now?" Patricia's hands moved slowly over her phone. The silence stretched out. Finally, she looked up. "It appears I cannot locate the specific email at this moment. It may have been a phone call." "Do you keep records of phone calls?" I asked. "Not generally, no. So there is no actual record of anyone complaining about my wind chimes." The board members were looking at each other now, and Patricia was starting to sweat. Susan Kowalski cleared her throat. "Patricia, this is concerning. We cannot fine a homeowner based on a complaint that cannot be verified. Did anyone actually complain, or did you issue this violation on your own initiative?" "I have been managing this HOA for 8 years, Patricia snapped. "I know a violation when I see one. Whether someone formally complained or not is irrelevant. The rules are the rules." "But that is not how this works," the other man on the board said. His name was Thomas Wright, and he looked genuinely upset. "We enforce rules based on complaints or obvious safety violations. We do not go around looking for reasons to fine people." "Those chimes are audible beyond his property line," Patricia insisted. "I heard them myself when I drove by." "So you initiated the violation," I said. "Not based on a neighbor complaint, but because you personally decided they were a problem." Patricia stood up abruptly. "Are we really going to let this man lecture us about how to run our own HOA? He moved here 6 months ago. He signed the covenant agreements. He is bound by the rules just like everyone else." "Nobody is above the rules," Susan said quietly. "Including you, Patricia. And if you are selectively enforcing violations against Mr. Jameson while ignoring identical violations throughout the neighborhood, that is a serious problem." The hearing devolved from there. The board called a recess to discuss matters privately, and I was asked to wait outside. I sat in the clubhouse lobby for 45 minutes, watching residents come and go from the gym and pool area. When I was called back in, the atmosphere had changed completely. Patricia looked furious, while the other board members looked uncomfortable. David Fletcher spoke. "Mr. Jameson, after reviewing your evidence and discussing the matter, we have decided to dismiss all current violations against your property. However, we are also implementing a new policy requiring all wind chimes to be registered with the HOA within 30 days. Yours will be grandfathered in as pre-approved, but we would like you to submit specifications for our records. It was a compromise, and not a terrible one. That seems reasonable, thank you. Additionally, Susan added, we will be conducting a comprehensive review of enforcement practices and consistency. Thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. Patricia said nothing, but the look she gave me could have curdled milk. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I came home from rehearsal to find my wind chimes gone, not just taken down, but completely missing. The hooks were still there, but the chimes themselves had vanished. I immediately called the police. The responding officer was a woman in her 30s named Officer Sarah Martinez. She took my statement, photographed the empty hooks, and asked if I had any idea who might have taken them. I have suspicions, I said, and explained the whole situation with the HOA. Officer Martinez made notes. That is a pretty expensive item to steal. You said they were custom-made. Yes, they were valued at around $8,000 when they were commissioned. Her eyebrows went up. $8,000 for wind chimes. I pulled up photos on my phone, showing the intricate craftsmanship and the certificate of authenticity. They were made by a master artisan in Belgium. Each tube is individually tuned and balanced. They are one of a kind. Well, that makes this grand theft, she said. I will file the report and we will investigate. Do you have any security cameras? I did not, which I was now regretting. But my neighbor Robert did. When Officer Martinez knocked on his door, he was more than happy to pull up his footage. The video was damning. At 2:15 in the afternoon, while I was at work, Patricia Morrison's silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway. She got out, walked directly to my porch, and took down the wind chimes. She carried them to her car, put them in her trunk, and drove away. The entire theft was captured in high definition. Officer Martinez watched the video twice, then made a call. I am going to need to bring Miss Morrison in for questioning. This is pretty clear evidence of theft. An hour later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to Patricia's house, which was only 4 streets over from mine. I watched from my living room window, not willing to miss this. They were there for 20 minutes before Patricia emerged in handcuffs, her face red and tears streaming down her cheeks. The police recovered my wind chimes from her garage. They were undamaged, thankfully, though she had wrapped them in an old blanket and shoved them in a corner. Officer Martinez returned them to me that evening. She is being charged with theft and trespassing, the officer explained. Given the value of the items, and the fact that this appears to be targeted harassment, the DA will probably take this seriously. You will need to come in and make a formal statement tomorrow. The neighborhood exploded with gossip. Patricia Morrison, the iron-fisted HOA president who had terrorized residents for years, had been arrested for stealing wind chimes. The story made the local news. HOA president arrested for theft after dispute over Symphony gift. Read the headline in the Denver Post. The phone calls started almost immediately. Other Meadowbrook Estates residents reached out to me, sharing their own horror stories about Patricia. The Hendersons and their supposedly wrong-colored roses. The Tanners, who had been fined for having their garage door open for more than 30 minutes. The Williamses, who had been told their children's chalk drawings on the driveway were graffiti. A pattern emerged of systematic harassment, selective enforcement, and abuse of power. Several residents had paid thousands of dollars in fines for violations that were never enforced against anyone else. Some had even sold their homes and moved rather than continue dealing with Patricia's tyranny. I organized a meeting at the clubhouse, advertised through the neighborhood social media page. Over 100 residents showed up, filling every chair and lining the walls. The remaining HOA board members, clearly shaken by the scandal, attended as well. David Fletcher stood at the front of the room, looking exhausted. "I want to start by apologizing. The board should have been more involved in day-to-day operations. We trusted Patricia to manage things appropriately, and clearly that trust was misplaced. We failed you all." One by one, residents stood and shared their stories. Some were angry, others were close to tears. A picture emerged of an HOA that had become a weapon in the hands of one vindictive woman who enjoyed wielding power over her neighbors. "What happens now?" someone called out. Susan Kowalski took the microphone. "First, Patricia has been removed from her position effective immediately. Second, we are conducting a full audit of all violations issued over the past 5 years. Anyone who believes they were unfairly fined can submit an appeal, which we will review with fresh eyes. Third, we are completely revising our enforcement policies to ensure this never happens again." "What about the money we already paid?" the Henderson woman asked. "We spent $3,000 fighting those rosebush fines." "We are looking into that," Thomas Wright said. "If violations were issued improperly, we will discuss restitution." The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, a new set of checks and balances had been proposed, including term limits for board members, mandatory transparency in enforcement actions, and a neutral third-party mediator for disputes. I went home that night feeling like something meaningful had happened. Change was hard, especially in a community that had operated one way for so long, but people were finally speaking up. Patricia's criminal case moved forward quickly. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had taken the Windchimes as part of her HOA duties to enforce covenant violations, but the video evidence made that defense absurd. She had stolen them after the board had already dismissed the violations. There was no legal justification. The DA offered her a plea deal: plead guilty to theft, pay full restitution, serve 200 hours of community service, and accept 2 years of probation. The alternative was going to trial and potentially facing jail time. She took the deal. I received a check for $8,000 to cover the value of the Windchimes, even though they had been returned undamaged. I also received a formal written apology from Patricia, clearly drafted by her lawyer, that was about as sincere as a telemarketer's smile. But the real victory was not Patricia's downfall. It was what happened to Meadowbrook Estates in the months that followed. The HOA board implemented every reform that had been discussed at that community meeting. They hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, replacing the single authoritarian president with a system of accountability and oversight. They established a community ombudsman position, filled by Robert, my neighbor, who volunteered to help resolve disputes before they escalated to violations and fines. The review of past violations resulted in over $60,000 in refunded fines to homeowners who had been improperly targeted. The Hendersons got their $3,000 back. The Tanners were reimbursed for the garage door fines. The Williamses received an apology and a check. My Windchimes still hang on my front porch, producing their beautiful, perfectly tuned notes every time the wind blows. They have become something of a neighborhood landmark. People walk by just to hear them, and I have caught more than one person standing on the sidewalk, eyes closed, just listening. Robert told me that property values in Meadowbrook Estates had actually increased after the scandal died down. Apparently, a neighborhood that dealt with its problems and made meaningful changes was more attractive than one that pretended everything was perfect while rotting from the inside. The Colorado Symphony Orchestra found the whole story hilarious. My colleagues started calling the Windchimes the Freedom Chimes, and the story became orchestra folklore. When we performed Beethoven's Ninth that fall, the guest conductor made a joke about it during rehearsal that had the entire ensemble laughing. I was invited to speak at a state HOA conference about the importance of fair enforcement and community accountability. It was surreal, standing in front of hundreds of board members and property managers, telling them about my experience. But people listened. Several communities reached out afterward, wanting to implement similar reforms. Patricia Morrison moved out of Meadowbrook Estates 6 months after her conviction. Rumor had it she relocated to Arizona, far from the neighbors she had terrorized and the community that had finally stood up to her. I felt no satisfaction in her departure, only relief that the chapter was truly closed. On a cool October evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, listening to my Windchimes play their symphony to the Colorado sunset. Robert walked over from his garden, carrying 2 of his prized roses. "These are for you," he said, handing them over. "The wrong shade of pink, according to Patricia. I think they are perfect," I laughed, accepting the flowers. "They are beautiful, Robert. Thank you." He settled into the other porch chair and we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the chimes. "You know," he said after a while, "I have lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. The last 6 months have been the best it has ever been. People actually talk to each other now. We have block parties. Kids play in the streets. It feels like a real community." That is what it should have been all along. True. But sometimes it takes someone willing to fight for what is right to show everyone else it is possible. Those wind chimes of yours, they did not just bring music to this street. They brought change. I looked up at the chimes, watching them sway in the breeze, each tube catching the last rays of sunlight. They were still just as beautiful as the day the orchestra had given them to me, still produced the same perfect notes, still reminded me of everything I had worked for and achieved. But now, they meant something more. They were a reminder that standing up for yourself mattered, that communities were only as good as the people willing to fight for fairness and justice, that rules without reason became tyranny, and that tyranny could only survive when good people stayed silent. Jennifer from next door walked by with her kids. Tommy, the younger one, stopped and looked up at the chimes with wide eyes. "Pretty music house," he declared, just as his mother had told me he always did. "Want to hear something cool?" I asked him. He nodded enthusiastically. I stood and gave the chimes a gentle push, setting them ringing clearly in the still evening air. Those notes are from a very famous piece of music called Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It is about joy and brotherhood and people coming together. Tommy listened intently, his small face serious. "It sounds happy." "It is happy," I agreed. "That is exactly what it is supposed to be." Jennifer smiled at me. "We are so glad you did not take them down. This neighborhood would not be the same without them." As they continued their walk, Robert raised his wine glass in a toast. "To wind chimes, justice, and neighborhoods that remember what community actually means." I clinked my glass against his. "And to standing your ground when you know you are right." The last light faded from the sky, and the streetlights flickered on throughout Meadowbrook Estates. Somewhere down the block, I could hear children laughing. A dog barked. Someone was grilling in their backyard, and the smell of charcoal and meat drifted on the breeze. It was the smell and sound of a real neighborhood, messy and imperfect and alive. The HOA still existed, still maintained the common areas and enforced sensible rules that kept property values stable and the community pleasant. But it no longer ruled through fear and arbitrary power. My phone buzzed with a text from my colleague at the Symphony. "Rehearsal moved to 9 tomorrow. Also, you are never living down the wind chime thing, just FYI." I smiled, typing back a response. I can live with that, because the truth was I was proud of what had happened. Not proud of the conflict or Patricia's arrest, but proud that when faced with injustice, I had not backed down. Proud that other people had found the courage to share their stories. Proud that a community had chosen to change rather than continue down a broken path. The wind chimes rang out again, clear and pure in the darkness. Each note was perfect, just as the Belgian artisan had intended, just as the orchestra committee had imagined when they commissioned them. They were a gift that kept giving, not just music, but a reminder of what was possible when you refused to let bullies win. When you documented everything, stood on principle, and gave people the information they needed to make their own choices. Robert eventually headed home, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my chimes. I stayed on the porch for another hour, wrapped in a blanket against the October chill, just listening and thinking. The next morning, I hung a small plaque beneath the wind chimes. It was simple, just a brass plate with an engraving, "Gift of the Colorado Symphony Orchestra. May their music bring joy to all who hear it." Several neighbors commented on it over the following days. Some took pictures. It became another small landmark in a neighborhood that was learning to take pride in individuality rather than rigid conformity. The reformed HOA board approved a new guideline allowing decorative items that enhanced community character, including wind chimes, garden art, and creative landscaping, as long as they were maintained in good condition. It was a complete reversal from Patricia's reign of beige conformity. Mailboxes could now be any shade of black, gray, or bronze. Grass could be anywhere from half an inch to 3 inches tall. House numbers could vary in style as long as they were clearly visible from the street. The little tyrannies that had made life miserable for so many were swept away. I ran into Patricia one time before she moved. It was at the grocery store in early November. We turned the corner into the same aisle and found ourselves face to face. She looked older, tired, and the confident arrogance that had defined her was gone. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she spoke, her voice quiet. "I hope you are happy." I considered my response carefully. "I am not happy about what happened to you, Miss Morrison, but I am happy that my neighbors no longer live in fear of their own HOA. I am happy that fairness won out over arbitrary power. And I am happy that my wind chimes still hang on my porch where they belong." She turned away without another word, pushing her cart past me. I watched her go, feeling nothing but a strange, hollow pity. She had wielded so much power for so long, and in the end, it had consumed her completely. As the holidays approached, Meadowbrook Estates underwent another transformation. The HOA approved a community decoration contest that encouraged creativity rather than compliance with strict rules. The neighborhood lit up with displays ranging from elegant to whimsical. My house featured simple white lights and a wreath on the door, but my wind chimes remained the real decoration, ringing out holiday music that I had slightly modified with removable clips to change their tuning. The Symphony performed the Nutcracker that December, and I invited several of my Meadowbrook neighbors to opening night. Robert came, as did Jennifer and her husband, and David Fletcher from the HOA board. Seeing them in the audience, dressed up and excited, reminded me why I loved music in the first place. It brought people together. It transcended petty differences and reminded us of our shared humanity. After the performance, we all went out for drinks at a bar near the concert hall. David raised his glass in a toast to Xavier, who taught us that sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when it is just about wind chimes. "It was never just about the wind chimes," I said. "It was about respect, about treating people like humans instead of problems to be managed. About remembering that rules should serve the community, not the other way around." Jennifer nodded. "You changed Meadowbrook Estates, Xavier." My kids are growing up in a neighborhood where they can draw with chalk on the driveway and play outside without someone threatening their parents with fines. That matters. The conversation drifted to other topics, to music and work and the everyday details of life. But underneath it all was a shared understanding that we had been through something together and come out better for it. When I got home that night, I stood on my porch despite the cold, looking up at my wind chimes. They were barely moving in the still winter air, but every so often a gentle breeze would stir them into song. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The years of practice, the auditions, the failures and small victories. I thought about accepting the position with the Colorado Symphony Orchestra and receiving these beautiful chimes as a gift. I thought about moving into this house with such hope and excitement. And I thought about Patricia Morrison and how her need for control had almost destroyed something precious. Not just my wind chimes, but the sense of community that should have existed in Meadowbrook Estates all along. The reforms held. The new HOA management company was professional and fair. The community ombudsman position became a model for other neighborhoods. People started actually attending board meetings, engaged and informed rather than afraid and silent. I served on a committee that drafted new covenant guidelines, making sure they were clear, fair, and consistently enforced. It was boring work, honestly, reading through legal language and debating semicolons. But it mattered. Every word we wrote, every policy we clarified was another barrier against the kind of abuse that Patricia had inflicted. Spring came to Denver, bringing warmer weather and the smell of fresh growth. I planted a garden in my front yard, something I had been nervous to do under Patricia's regime. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and flowers all mixed together in a cottage garden style that would have given her an aneurysm. The HOA approved it without question. My first tomato came in early June, and I shared it with Robert over yet another evening on my porch. The wind chimes played their symphony, the setting sun painted the mountains gold and pink, and life felt complete in a way it had not for a very long time. "You know what I appreciate most about all of this?" Robert asked, biting into a slice of tomato still warm from the sun. "What?" "That you could have just taken the chimes down. You could have avoided all the drama, all the conflict, all the hassle, but you did not. You stood up, not just for yourself, but for all of us who had learned to live with Patricia's nonsense because fighting back seemed too hard." "Someone had to," I said simply. "But someone actually did. That is what matters." The symphony season ended in late June with a performance of Beethoven's Ninth. It seemed fitting, completing the circle that had started with my wind chimes and the trouble they had caused. Standing on the conductor's podium, leading the orchestra and chorus through that magnificent final movement, I felt the full weight of what the music meant: joy, brotherhood, the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. It was all there in Beethoven's notes, and it was all there in my own small story too. The audience gave us a standing ovation. I saw familiar faces in the crowd, neighbors from Meadowbrook Estates, who had come to support me and enjoy the music. After the performance, several of them waited by the stage door. "That was incredible," Jennifer said, her eyes bright with tears. "I had no idea music could make you feel so much." "That is what it is supposed to do," I told her. "Make you feel, make you think, remind you that you are alive." We all went out for late-night diner food, an unlikely group of friends brought together by conflict and wind chimes. The conversation flowed easily, jumping from topic to topic, full of laughter and warmth. As I drove home that night, windows down, cool summer air rushing through the car, I realized how much my life had changed in the past year. I had moved to Meadowbrook Estates, looking for a quiet place to call home. a refuge from the demands of my career. Instead, I had found a community that needed someone to fight for it, and in fighting, had built something far more valuable than peace and quiet. I had found real connection, real friendship, real community, not the manufactured version that Patricia had tried to enforce, but the messy, authentic kind that grew from shared struggle and mutual respect. My wind chimes were waiting when I got home, glinting in the streetlight. I stood beneath them for a moment, reaching up to set them ringing. The notes floated out into the quiet night, pure and clear and perfect. Somewhere in Arizona, Patricia Morrison was probably settled into a new house, maybe even a new HOA. I wondered if she had learned anything from what had happened, if she had gained any insight into how her behavior had hurt people. Probably not. People like her rarely did, but that was not my concern anymore. My concern was right here, in this neighborhood that had learned to stand up for itself, in these friendships that had been forged through conflict, in these wind chimes that had started it all. I went inside, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at my piano. I had been working on a composition, inspired by everything that had happened. It was called Meadowbrook Suite, and it told the story in music rather than words. The first movement was tense and discordant, representing Patricia's reign and the fear she had instilled. The second movement was chaotic, full of conflict and struggle, representing the fight for justice. The third movement was triumphant and joyful, representing the community coming together and the reforms that followed. And the fourth movement, the one I was working on now, was peaceful and contemplative. It represented what came after, the quiet satisfaction of knowing you had done the right thing, the gentle contentment of a life well lived in a community worth being part of. I worked on it until well past midnight, letting the music flow from my fingers, capturing emotions that words could never quite express. When I finally went to bed, I left the windows open, and the last thing I heard before falling asleep was the soft chime of my wind chimes in the night breeze. The summer progressed, hot and dry as Denver summers always were. The Symphony was on hiatus, giving me time to teach some private students and work on my own projects. The Meadowbrook Suite was coming along nicely. I planned to premiere it at the neighborhood's annual summer concert in the park. The concert was a new tradition, started by the reformed HOA as a way to bring the community together. Local musicians performed, kids sang, and everyone brought picnic blankets and lawn chairs to enjoy an evening of music under the stars. I performed the Meadowbrook Suite with a small chamber ensemble I had pulled together from Symphony colleagues. Before we began, I explained the piece and what it represented. The crowd listened in rapt attention. When the final note faded away, there was a moment of profound silence. Then the applause started, building until it was thunderous. People were on their feet, not just clapping but cheering. Robert found me afterward, tears streaming down his weathered face. "That was beautiful, Xavier. You captured exactly what it felt like to live through all of that." Others echoed the sentiment. The Meadowbrook Suite became something of a neighborhood anthem, a reminder of where they had been and how far they had come. The local paper ran a story about it. Composer turns HOA dispute into musical masterpiece. The article detailed the whole saga, from the initial violation notice to Patricia's arrest to the reforms that followed. It ended with a quote from me. "Art comes from life, and life is messy and complicated and full of conflict, but it is also full of beauty and hope and the possibility of change." My wind chimes gave me a gift far greater than music. They gave me a community worth fighting for. The story was picked up by a few national outlets, and suddenly, I was getting emails and phone calls from people across the country who had their own HOA horror stories. It was overwhelming and heartbreaking. So many people living under the thumb of petty tyrants, paying endless fines, losing their homes over ridiculous violations. I could not fight all their battles, but I could share what I had learned. I wrote an article for a national magazine about standing up to HOA abuse, documenting everything, knowing your rights, and finding allies in your community. The response was incredible. Lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes reached out, offering their insights and adding to the conversation. State legislators who were working on HOA reform bills contacted me for testimony. Advocacy groups formed, dedicated to protecting homeowners from the kind of abuse Patricia had inflicted. It was bigger than I ever imagined. My Windchimes had not just changed Meadowbrook Estates. They had sparked a conversation about power, accountability, and what it meant to live in a community governed by rules. But through it all, I never forgot what really mattered. On quiet evenings, I still sat on my porch with a glass of wine, listening to the chimes and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink and purple. I still had dinners with Robert and Jennifer and other neighbors. I still played music because I loved it, not for fame or recognition. The wind chimes hung where they had always hung, singing their perfect notes to anyone who cared to listen. They had survived theft and scandal and national attention. They were just as beautiful as the day the orchestra gave them to me, and they would hang on my porch for as long as I lived in that house, because they were more than just wind chimes. They were a symbol of resistance, of standing up for what was right, of refusing to let bullies win. They were a reminder that sometimes the smallest things, the things that seem barely worth fighting for, turn out to be the most important battles of all. And every time the wind set them ringing, playing their perfect symphony to the Colorado sky, I was reminded of exactly why I fought, and why it mattered, and why I would do it all again in a heartbeat. The wind chimes were a gift from the Symphony Orchestra. But the real gift was discovering what I was capable of when pushed, and learning that communities could heal and change and become better versions of themselves. That was worth more than any fine Patricia Morrison could have ever levied. That was worth everything.